Hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Benmergui. This is Not That Kind of Rabbi. Not That Kind of Rabbi is now not just Ralph Benmergui, it's also Avram Rosenzweig. We're doing stuff together these days. And how are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm just coming off a bout of COVID, which seems to be making its way around, but it went very quickly, and that makes me very happy. Very
Yes,
happy.
yes. Well, everybody who's got their shots usually has minimal effects these days. Some people
Right.
still don't, though. I mean, I'm still shocked to see how many people die, and even in the province of Ontario, how many people die from COVID in a week, 54, 72 of them. And so it's not nothing. And I know we all want it to go away, but wanting something to go away doesn't mean it goes away. So it's
Very true.
stay vigilant is what I would offer people. I know everyone's not wearing masks most often these days. And after 3 years, mentally, you just want to get on with it and feel normal again. So I get it. Well, I don't know when people will be listening to this, but we're doing this just before the beginning of the Jewish high holidays. And those things, it means different things to everybody, the high holidays. For some people, it was the part that turned them on. And for some people, it was the part that turned them off. I remember the idea that you had to buy a ticket for the high holidays and thinking to myself, when I was a kid, you would go down to College Street on the subway in Toronto to Maple Leaf Gardens for a hockey game, and the scalpers would be yelling down into the stairwell as you're coming up, "Who's got tickets? Who's got tickets? Who
Right.
wants golds? Who wants golds?" And,
Right.
and I think to myself, when these big synagogues, I used to call them the big box synagogues in Toronto, they'd fill up on the high holidays and people would pay. So I changed my mind a bit about that when I belonged to a small synagogue for over 20 years in Toronto, the First Neriver congregation down on Brunswick Avenue. And on high holidays, we had to rent the JCC, the Bloor Y, Bloor and Spadina,
That's right. Yeah.
for everybody to be in the gymnasium. And after a while, I started to think, you know what, these people who paid for these tickets, they are making sure that we have funding for the next year. So for the 50 to 75 people who show up every Saturday, on behalf of them, I say thank you to all those people who, yeah,
Correct.
they only
Yeah.
showed up for a one day of Rosh Hashanah, the morning service maybe, and the night of Yom Kippur and Kol Nidre, and that'd be it. They'd be gone. But I just thought, you know what, you're doing your thing. You're keeping your bookmark in there, your tab in there, and if that's the way you do it, that's the way you do it. So I stopped thinking of it in the same way. What was your
Yeah, no,
experience on that?
I agree with you 100%. I think that it's a misnomer to say that, well, this is disgusting that they're charging me to come to shul or synagogue or temple. Well, it's not, because generally you pay for most things that you have to enter into. And you're right. I think the fundamental piece is this is a synagogue. It's a movement. It's a corporation. It requires funding in order to keep it going. And I saw that firsthand. My father was a rabbi in Kitchener, and the expenses are tremendous. If the boiler goes, somebody's got to pay for it. So I agree with you. I think your change in thinking was what was accurate. I once had a situation, however, when I went to shul on the high holidays and I hadn't purchased a ticket. It was a Sephardic shul, actually. And I come to the front door and the fellow says, "Could I have your ticket, please?" I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't have a ticket." He said, "Well, then you can't come in." I said, "But somebody told me that I could." He said, "Oh, who told you you could?" I said, "God." He says, "Well, I'm sorry, you still can't come in." Um, so I didn't. But I think the vast majority of shuls, including that shul, I'm sure, will let people in if they hadn't paid. I think there is a generosity of spirit that you will find at synagogues.
Well, you would hope so, because in essence, if someone is in a situation where they say, I don't have a
Yeah,
ticket,
Right.
uh, who are we to turn them away on that day? Now,
Correct.
if
Yes.
120 people show up and say I don't have a ticket, you've got a different issue. You've probably charged too much for the ticket at that
That might be.
point.
Yeah, no, that might be. And that doesn't happen.
No, no, it
There's
doesn't happen.
no.
Occasionally, somebody needs to get it. At the synagogue I go to here in Hamilton, this year, you don't have to pay to come.
Mhm.
You don't have to pay to come. If you want to make a contribution, you make a contribution. And some people have more money than others and give generously all the time. So it ends up working out fine. And it's just one of those weird things when you're a kid to see it and just think,
Yes.
I have to
Yes.
buy a ticket to come to
Right.
synagogue on the biggest holidays of the year. So that's one aspect of it. The other one is for me over the years, I find with my proximity or distance from Jewish practice and congregational practice, particularly, sometimes there's a high tide and a low tide. There's times where I really feel it and I really want to be there, and there's other times where I don't feel it and I just think I don't know if this is the best way for me to do my spiritual work. Um, Usually, though, when I get near the high holidays, that feeling comes up again, and I start to feel that closeness with everything. And part of that is because there are certain rituals attached, particularly to Yom Kippur, to the Day of Atonement, um, that really ground you. That you can't eat for 25 hours. You can't even drink water for 25 hours. That you walk, you don't drive. That was the way I was brought up. And so for me, those really big differences from the rest of the year really wake me up,
Mhm.
and which is the purpose of it after all, right? And the shofar, the ram's horn blowing at Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and the traditions around that. I love all that. It is. I actually think we have geared our society, even though it's mostly a Christian society, to the idea that the year starts in September.
Mhm.
September, maybe October, but that's when a year starts. Harvest is
Right.
in and the seasonal cycle is over. January 1st seems highly arbitrary to me. It's like
Right.
you're in the dead of winter. Why all of a sudden is this a great idea? It's not even
Yes.
attached to a solstice. It's just boom, here's the new year. So pagan wise, it doesn't work. What comes up for you when you get near holidays like this one?
Well, I because I've ensconced myself more so in Jewish ritual over the last year or two through my learning, which is on a daily basis through teaching. I give a couple classes a week, and also I started to attend synagogue more often. I attend a little shtibel across the street, which is called Mishkan Avram, and a shtibel basically is sort of a haphazard synagogue which has come together of generally of a bunch of men, very often over 50 years old, and it's very orthodox, very traditional in nature. It's very humble. The kiddushes are fabulous, which is the food that we eat after the service. And a lot of people come to synagogue apparently because of the kiddush.
Of course.
Uh, Someone told me there's an old adage in Judaism: it's challah, not prayer. Okay, so I
Right.
think a lot of people respond to the food aspect of it. I was surprised by that, but apparently that's the case. So I'm excited. I think the edge is taken off a little bit of the high holidays because I practice more during the year. But the kicker is that I established about 5 years ago a synagogue of my own, and I call it the Forest Shul or the Forest Synagogue. And essentially, what I do is I take about 25 or 30 people into Earl Bales Park, which is a gorgeous park here at Shepherd and Bathurst in Toronto. We follow this trail right to the end, which is on top of a cliff, and there are rocks that are set up. It reminds me of the story of Jacob when he fell asleep, having gathered all the rocks around his head. And we sit on these rocks, and people sit wherever they want, and we do a service. And it's super exciting because we're in nature. So when we come to the part of blowing the shofar, which is the ram's horn, I sort of call that nature on nature. You can imagine
Mm.
being in the middle of this gorgeous forest, right? And you're right on the abyss, really. And you blow the shofar, and if the sound is clear, it just trails off. into the natures. It's almost as though the leaves of the trees are gathering the notes and taking it higher. So for me, it's a really beautiful experience.
So in the service that you don't do the whole service that is in a
No,
synagogue. What, how do you pick and choose
right.
what to do while you're out
I'm a really good picker. I've been
there?
picking for years. So you ask a really good question. I kind of break it up into two or three pieces. We do the traditional Ralph. There are songs that one would find in high holiday liturgy, which are very gripping, which are very touching. Avinu Malkeinu is one of them. Avinu Malkeinu. And of course, another one is Ununatana Tokef, who shall live and who shall die. So I take those prayers and I incorporate them into my service. And people sing and we sing in and around. And once again, it is just a very, very beautiful moment. And Avinu Malkeinu is the type of song that if you want, it never really has to stop.
Oh yeah, it's a
Right?
chant. It's a chant.
Yes, it is.
Avinu Malkeinu,
It's beautiful.
Avinu Malkeinu.
Malkeinu.
All
And then
right,
we just keep going
Avinu
and going.
Malkeinu,
Right.
Moshiach. La da la da
And
ba da.
everybody's into it, and there are tears streaming down
Chesed
their cheeks.
v'rachamim.
Amen.
La da la da
La,
la
la, la,
da
la, 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 la.
da
And if we
da
would want, you can do it again, right?
Avinu. Oh, I can do it forever. Believe me,
I
I
know, I
walk
know.
around singing it all the time at that point. Eh,
Beautiful song.
So there, you said something a little bit before this, though, about being in there and picking and choosing what to do. So Avinu Malkeinu, but the other one that I love is Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die, because I remember a teaching I learned a while ago, which was let's not take that physically and literally, not who's going to actually physically die and who's actually going to live. It's what part of us is going to die off and what
Oh,
part of us is going to be born,
oh, nice.
right? So that you look at it in terms not of your the ego, your own mortality. Am I the one who's going to die? Who in here is going to die this year? That takes me out of it. If I leave myself in the idea of every year there are things in us, if we keep growing, that die off, just like a tree's leaves die off and new leaves come. For a person, there's that opportunity to let something die. um, uh, a grudge can die, uh, um, a resentment can die, attachment to wealth can die. Something, anything can die, and something can be born out of it. And what part of you is going to come alive
A
in the
nice
year
thought.
that comes?
That's a lovely thought. I like that very much, very much. But I do have a question for you.
Yes,
And I'm looking for your book because I'm reading your book. I'm slow to read because I read about 10 books at a time. Um,
I know the feeling.
yeah, right. It's terrible, but that's
That's
what I
the
do.
best. It's the best.
Thank you. Anyways, you almost died yourself, right?
Yeah.
So when you read Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die, I understand your explanation, and I
Mhm.
think it's lovely, and I'm going to incorporate that into my service. But how did you feel when you read Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die after going through that?
I felt like I should stop worrying about it so much. I felt like it's going to happen. You know, it's like Woody Allen's line, right? Death. I get it. It's just not for me,
Yeah, right,
right? Right.
right.
um, we all have this thing of the great injustice of dying. And I think if you've been given a diagnosis of something that could kill you, um, even if, and in my case, I was reassured relatively quickly, this isn't the thing that's going to kill you right now. It'll something will kill you, but this one isn't going to be the one in this moment. And that was within 3 weeks, 4 weeks of knowing. But in that time, you really have to look at everybody around you and think about who have I loved, and who has loved me. What kind of work have I put into that? Because that's all that's going to be left. So for me, I just found that it was like it was no longer something that could have terror attached to it. It was more like a companion piece to what a whole human life is. I read something today from a woman I've only met a few times here in Hamilton, but her husband died suddenly in his 40s, actually 5 years ago. 5 years ago last weekend. And he was a lovely man. He did brilliant stuff. He would find vacant warehouses and put on beautiful dinner parties that people could
Oh,
come
wow.
to. So
Wow.
he was a really interesting guy. He was full of life and the glint. She wrote a beautiful piece about him in Facebook. And I wrote back to her to say how beautiful it was, but also that, Stephen Jenkinson in Die Wise says, the human lifespan is not life. It is the human moment in the perpetual constant flow of
Mm,
life.
mm, good.
Right. So that I started thinking like that, I'd been thinking about the idea of dying since I was, could think. And I just thought it was such cruel and outrageous joke, that God would, as a kid thinking of God as this guy who does stuff. And I think to myself, what kind of what would you do that to somebody for? Like you give me life and they go, by the way, I'm taking it away afterwards.
Yeah.
Like, what are you
Yeah.
nuts? Like, what did I do? I didn't do anything. So, it takes a long time, I think, to evolve out of that kind of pediatric version of what life is and what death is. So when I
I,
see it, it's different. Yeah.
I just want to pick up on this if you don't mind, and if it's too intimate, just tell me. But I think that the high holidays, to answer a previous question of yours, what is it like for me? It's an ominous occasion. I've led services on Yom Kippur night, Kol Nidre, and I was standing in front of 400 people at Congregation Habonim, and I felt so incredibly humbled by the honor and by the moment that we were in. There was a component to it whereby I was thinking about my life versus my eventual demise. I've thought about my sister who passed away, both my parents. It was a very heavy moment, and it was very spiritual in nature, however you define that. I'm just curious with you, Ralph. I know there was a time, but prior to those 3 weeks, where you actually thought you were going to leave this earth. So was that in all at all like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Were those feelings similar? Were those thoughts similar? You were the place you were in, were they similar?
Well, what comes to mind is in Yom Kippur, we do the vidui. We knock on our chest.
Yeah.
We count our sins. We humble ourselves to the idea that we are not to be pointing the finger outward, but to look inside. And I think that one of the things when somebody says, you might actually not be in good shape here, you might not make it, is that it's an accounting. You have to go, wait a minute, where am I at? What have I done? What haven't I done? So on that level, it's sort of an amplification of that. But on the other level of people and your heart, because knocking on the heart is a little breaking of your heart, because spirituality cannot enter a person until they have a broken heart. If you've never been vulnerable that way, it's really hard to get there, right? Every figure we study in Bibles and scriptures and in Hindu Bhagavad Gitas, and there is heartbreak. There is people who have to fall from their grace. The Buddha, a prince, who has to make a wake up moment and go, what does it matter, this princely life? It's not for me. So that happens. I think the biggest thing that happened was I have 4 kids. So I was looking at my children's lives and thinking, I I'm going to disappoint them. I'm not
Mhm.
going to be around for them. And especially my two youngest at that point were really young, 3 and 1, or 4 and 1, and 2. And I just thought, what kind of, they're always going to have this thing of, I didn't know my dad. So that
Yeah.
heartbreak stuff was part of it, reading them a story without them realizing that I'm sitting here thinking, this might not be going on very long. So I liked it for that. You know, I'm still here to talk about it. So who's to know, right? If it had gone the other way, I don't know if I would have had as much equanimity as I do in having survived it, right? But
By
I
the way,
think,
there's
so one more thing, the in Kippur is a rehearsal for death. I mean, you
yeah,
dress in white, you dress in the shroud. You are like when you die in our religion, you are wrapped in white. You are wrapped in a shroud, and we are to dress in white, and we are to die and be born into our moment again. That you're to finish your business with people. Yeah, Rosh Hashanah. You're supposed to get in touch with them and go, you know what? If I offended you, I'm really sorry, and I think I did offend you. Or I owe you $215, and I just realized I've avoided paying you. Here's your money. I'm so sorry. It's
Mhm.
closure, right? So there is a sort of end, contemplation, denial of self, and then on we go.
There's an interesting story that's told in light of what you said about the broken heart. The great Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement, he instructed one of his Talmidim, one of his students, to blow the shofar on the high holidays. His name was Mordechai. And he said, Mordechai, go home and study on the shofar and learn about it, understand the nuances, see what the Kabbalah, the mysticism has to say about it. Sure enough, Mordecai went home and he just ensconced himself in study having to do with the ram's horn, the shofar. And he wrote down these little pieces that were significant and that he would carry in his pocket on the day of the high holidays themselves, so that when he blew them, he could review them quickly and understand what he's doing more intimately. So he comes to shul and he's ready to blow the shofar. The Baal Shem Tov asks him to come up. He reaches into his pocket and the note, the Patek is not there. He had lost it. And he looked again. You know how we go through all of our
Yeah.
pockets, right? And ultimately, he couldn't find the little Patek. He couldn't find the little piece of paper. So he blew the shofar and he tried to remember what he had learned. Once he had finished, he went to the corner of the shul and he sat down and he sobbed and he cried because he felt as though he had disappointed the Baal Shem Tov. He had disappointed the Olam, the congregation, and mostly had disappointed God. And at the end of the service, the Baal Shem Tov found him, Mordechai, sitting in the corner of the synagogue. And he comes over to him and he sees him crying, he sees him sobbing. And he says to him, why are you sobbing? You blew the shofar in the most beautiful way, perhaps more beautiful than I've ever heard. He says, Rav, he says, I'm so sorry. He says, I forgot so much of my learning. I had written it down and I just couldn't find that little petek. And the Baal Shem Tov sees that his heart had been broken by that. He says, you should know something. He says, God responds firstly and foremostly to those people whose hearts are broken. So
Mhm.
that's why you did such a beautiful job. And that really touched me because I had mentioned in our last podcast together that my sister Javi's husband had been murdered.
Mhm.
And her heart is broken, was broken, still is, and she tried to turn that into a positive in terms of her relationship with God and her prayer. And I think she's done a terrific job of it, really.
Mhm. Mhm. So hard,
Yeah, to say the least.
so hard, so sad.
Yeah.
You know, for me, one of the things that's a real challenge is the way we've written the stories of Torah and the way they've been used is dualistically, that there's a God and there is us, and this is a conversation. And I know you and I have talked about this before, but it's problematic for me in that I've really gravitated towards a non-dualistic view of just even the use of the word God, that it's just a placeholder. But what has happened, I think, is that it has also allowed us to remove ourselves from the what Thich Nhat Hanh calls the interbeing of life, that we are all completely connected in a web of life. I was speaking to a group of Jewish people from Owen Sound last week, and I was talking about eco-spirituality, just like you going into the forest, right? So that people can connect to the actual earth they stand on when they talk these things. And that the idea that you have to go into a building where, you can sort of, rent a God, just go in, go to the building, and then go home, get out a lease. It doesn't work for me very well. And when I think of a non-dualistic approach to God, I think that everything is God, everything. This conversation, the moment together, the tree that breathes outside and breathes life into me and I breathe life into it, the interactions, Sylvia Boorstein, who is well studied as a Buddhist and is also an Orthodox Jew. She had a beautiful definition of karma that I keep talking about lately, which is that every single thing that has happened in the universe had to happen the way it happened for the moment right now where you and I are talking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that our responsibility is the next moment. Because that's going to dictate what happens 1,000 years from now. And I love that because then it connects me to this Day of Atonement in a different way. It connects me to this renewal in a different way because I have to think about what my next moment is as much as reflect before I think about it, take reflection on what's gone on this year, right? But my conversation is internal and it is ecosystem. That's why when it's like who's going to live and who's going to die can be in an ecosystem. It's like, well, am I going to live? Am I going to die?
Yes.
Or it can be an ecosystem of what is going to live and what is going to die, because everything is part of the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm. That's a lovely thought. It's a lovely thought. I just want to add to it. We're talking about the various different approaches to the high holidays. There is a lot of discussion about the idea of Bein Adam Lamakom, that on the high holidays and prior and during the 10 days of repentance, because it is a 10-day holiday, more or less, starts with Rosh Hashanah. Then you have those few days in between where you're introspective, where you really do your very best to understand how you were this past year to God, which is the Bein Adam Lamakom, how you were Bein Adam Lachavero, which is between you and other people. And there's a third piece that is seldomly talked about, and it kind of overlaps with what you're saying. And I've been repeating it as much as I can possibly in Shul on Shabbat and other such places. There's a concept called Bein Adam La'atzmi. And that is my relationship between me and myself. And within traditional Judaism, the Shiva world that I went to, there's not a lot of introspection in that way, Ralph. There's not. There's very, very little discussion and thought about have I embraced myself? Have I responded this past year? That old adage of be as good to yourself as you are to your best friend, right? Which means love yourself, know who you are, understand your gifts, understand your talents, understand what God has given you. And by the same token, look at the things that you really have to work on within yourself and develop them. Bein Adam La'atzmi. So that's also a very, very big piece of the high holidays, which I focus on, and again, which I try to point out to other people that they should be doing as well.
So, but why do you think then in the Orthodox world and in the studying the yeshiva world, that that's not something that is cultivated? Why isn't it?
I think that world became so God-centric.
Right.
And that's fine, but not when you forget about yourself. Very often I'll be in Orthodox circles and I'll hear people say, well, the self is not important. That's not a Jewish concept. It's not at all. I mean, there's a classic thing in Judaism. Why did the Jews keep complaining when they were walking through the desert? They had water from the sky, they had bread, they had God's security, they had everything they needed. And one of the answers that's given, same thing with Adam and Eve. Why did they do the one thing they weren't supposed to do? Similar answers given, which is, you know what? Thank you for all of this, but I want to bruise my elbows and I want to scrape my knees, my existential needs, if you will. I want to understand who I am. I'm an author, I'm a poet, I'm a speaker, I'm a communicator. I want to get out there and do it. And I'm really happy that God has given me all this manna, right? And taking care of me. But I wanted to go do a gig. That's who I am. That's what I'm supposed to develop and bring to this world. I think that the yeshiva world lost sight of all of that. And it just became too God centric. And within that process, forgot about ourselves.
And perhaps that's why I find myself saying, okay, can we stop saying said this and God did that and God wants this and because I think it takes responsibility out of us, but it also takes a relationship that if not the central thing about our Jewish relationship to God is that it's unknowable, then what are we talking about? How do you know what God wants if it's unknowable? You've already had the contradiction right there. Just leave that part alone. It's none of your business. Just your business is to be to actualize yourself in a way that is a healthy addition to what comes next, as opposed to a cancerous addition to what comes next. That's enough work for a human being in this short little life that we have, right?
Sure. Yeah. By the way, for your own edification, when you study the book of Devarim, which is the fifth book in the Pentateuch, the five books of Moses, it's essentially Moses giving a speech to the Jewish people. So last week we did Ki Tavo, and in Ki Tavo he talked about the curses and the blessings. The curses if you follow God's words, the blessings if you don't. But you will find almost maybe only a couple of times you'll find the phrase Vayedaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, that God spoke to Moshe saying. You don't read that at all as you would in the prior books. In Devarim, it's Moses talking. And I think it kind of speaks to what you're saying.
So it becomes a human talking to humans at that
Yes,
point?
very much so. Yeah, he's standing on the mountain and he's talking to the Jewish people, and it's him to them.
Interesting. So we bring it back down to earth. There is this ladder we climb in the high holidays, I think. I always like the last service of Yom Kippur Nila. There's an intensity to that. You haven't had anything to eat or drink. And I learned, well, relatively early on, if you don't spend the entire time staring at a clock going, what am I going to eat? You're going to have a much better experience.
Yes.
You just keep yourself busy doing what's there. But there are these, ritualized, repetitive cycles that bring you closer. And it reminds me of the kind of mystical parts of religions, the Sufis, the Hasidim, that when you said before, there's not the part about your relationship to you. In those, it seems the idea is to lose yourself. But then I don't see that as not having a relationship to you. I think I guess I'd go to the Buddhist way there, because I think our biggest issue is that we construct an ego of who we are, and we cling to it, and we resist others, and we stay in our shell of I am Ralph, not I am that I am. I am Ralph. And it leaves us lesser, not more, to just continually, with the biggest barrier to a spiritual thing, which is why we're talking about the breaking of the heart for spirit, is the ego. If one cannot bend their knee to what we're going through, then they will have hubris. And we now, I think, live in a very a society and a time of great hubris, where the individual is to be worshipped, and the individual's a so-called achievement, i.e., material achievement, is the point of this exercise. And we, in the United Kingdom right now, in their health ministry, they have a sub-ministry of literally of loneliness,
That's correct. Yes. Yes.
right? So that's where we've gone to, is we no longer have extended family. We no longer have a sharing or gifting economy. It is accumulation and extraction. And so, one of the hypocrisies that young people would talk about when I was young, and we were rejecting a lot about religion, for instance, was going to a synagogue and seeing, or a church or anywhere, and seeing people in very expensive clothing, making their statement that they have arrived. And the synagogue itself, becoming this sort of, which synagogue is the bigger and better synagogue, as a reflection of that ego state. And I love the idea that you're taking people into the woods, because then all that's gone. It's not a beautiful
No.
synagogue, it's a beautiful world, and all that's gone.
There's a lot of interesting discussion that we could take out of this. You talk about the beautiful synagogue, versus the nature of what we'll be doing. I asked the rabbi recently, Rabbi Shlomo Gamara, who's a very big Talmud Chacham, very big scholar in Talmud. I said, Rabbi, the temple was pretty opulent. And there are many synagogues in our communities that are also aesthetically very, very wealthy, rich, affluent, if you will. Why don't we cut that in half, let's say, and build a lovely synagogue? Not one that's imbued with various frescoes on the ceiling and so on. And instead use the other money towards the betterment of humankind, poor people and so on. He said, that's a very good question. He didn't really give me an answer, but I sometimes it's satisfying just to hear from a scholar that you asked a good question, and I felt good about that. but I often wonder about that, Ralph. You'll find that some of the most inspiring places to pray, to reach out to God, to have those spiritual moments, are environments that would be considered very plain, very simple, not opulent in any way whatsoever. And that in itself seems to help one reach out to God or whatever their religious or spiritual predilection is. So, yeah, you make a good point. And that's really the experience that we have in the forest. The Breslover Hasidim, it's a sect of Hasidim. The leader was Rav Nachman Mebreslov of the 1700s, and he's very well respected nowadays. They literally, many of them would go into the forest early in the morning and pray to God and do somersaults and yell out to God and hang from trees. And in fact, you saw sort of a representation of that in the series Shtisel. Did you watch
Yeah,
Shtisel?
yeah, sure.
You remember when they were in the forest doing all those
Yeah.
somersaults and acrobat? That was representation of Breslov.
Well, there's that story of the kid, with the rabbi. His son keeps going out into the forest and then coming back to the house, and he's like, "Why don't you? Like, I want you to pray with me." And he just next day, kid comes home, goes straight out into the forest, and then comes home. He goes, "Okay, what are you doing out there?"
Yeah.
And he says, "I'm praying out there." He goes, "Well, why didn't you pray in here with me?" He goes, "Well, the reception's better out there."
That's great. I
Right?
love that. Yeah.
Because that's the thing is we have also depaganized our religions, our Judeo-Christian religions. We in the Christian world, particularly, there was the murder of thousands of women as witches because they were connected to the natural cycles of life and the solstice and the menstruation cycles and the moon, and they still found these to be sacred. And what we've done is we've made only this thing called God sacred. And it is removed from the idea that everything in indigenous culture, everything has spirit, everything. And even in Christianity, you can find that, when Jesus spoke about, I am in that piece of wood, I am in that, under that rock, I am everything, I am everywhere. That's what I talk about when I'm talking about a non-dualistic approach to God. That if everything is sacred, then how can we do what we're doing right now?
Mhm.
How can we literally declare war on the earth?
Mhm.
The most damaging line there is: man has dominion over nature, not stewardship, dominion. And so it's not a coincidence that the burning of women and the depaganizing of Christianity, and certainly of Judaism, and the rationalism that followed, is also completely concurrent with the rise of capitalism. They both happen at the same time for the same reason, for the same accumulation of power and wealth away from people. That everything around you is not sacred, that's how we live now. Everything is profane. So we yearn to go to some building to get it done. We yearn for a aha moment. I once did a TV series with a good friend of mine, Alan Novak, and it was called Five Seekers. And we took five people who had given up on religion and gave them different experiences in Sedona, Arizona, and in Cortez Island, BC. And a lot of these things were outside of the norm of religion as we know it, but were spiritual experiences. And what I realized with many of the people, some of the five people, was what they wanted was aha. They wanted a bolt of lightning to hit them and everything would be fine. But what they didn't want is the hard work and the slow grind,
Mhm. Mhm.
which sometimes feels like you're on the right track and sometimes feels like, what am I doing? This is like, I feel nothing. When you talked about at the beginning about Kiddush, about people after the service eating, it's not that they're gluttons. It's that food is essence. Food is life, and to share that with people and to talk and say, how you been? How's it going?
Yeah, very much. I agree. Yeah.
That's community. And
Yes.
community is one of the two major functions of religion, right? So,
Yeah, we just get a kick out of eating herring and what we call nothings. You know what nothings are?
well, when I went to Ashkenazi synagogue at Beth Shalom,
Yeah.
I'd look at my aunt was a pastry chef, but in Morocco it was French pastries, right?
Yes.
Eclairs, petit four. So I'm looking at this stuff and I go, what is that? And the guy beside me goes, it's a nothing. I said, no, what is it? It's
Right.
called a nothing. It's literally called. And then I
Yeah.
bit it and I went, this is awful. There's nothing in it. He goes, this is exactly what I'm telling you.
Right, but the idea is you take a piece of schmaltz herring
Oof.
or marinated herring and you put it on top of the nothing, maybe with a little bit of tzibula, which is onions, and you bite into it, and it is an
It's
Ashkenazi
something.
delicacy.
Yeah, see,
It becomes something.
yeah,
Listen, I want to ask you if I can show you my shofar.
yes, please.
Now I'm
And
going to show
I'll
you.
remind people that herring is so not Sephardic. It's almost unbelievable,
Right, but you will find them now at Sephardic kiddushes. You
which is
will.
so heartbreaking. I'd rather see sardines, but here
It's
we
the
go.
host culture has had that impact.
It,
I'm sorry, you know.
you should be.
I apologize. So Ralph, we've been talking a little bit about the shofar.
Aha.
This is one shofar. This is a simple shofar. It's a ram's horn, and the idea behind it is that Rosh Hashanah is like a coronation. It's really the birth of the world, and therefore, like we would at a coronation, which we will see in I guess a month or two with King Charles, we would blow a horn. We would blow the ram's horn, and this kind of
Hmm.
represents too when Abraham was about to slaughter his son, and instead the angels came down and said, "No, no, no, don't slaughter your son. Slaughter this goat." So this is a remembrance of that. So I have this shofar here, and I'll blow it in 1 second. And then I have this shofar here.
Now, you should, for people just listening, it is much longer and it curves and turns, and it's three times the size of the small shofar, which you can hold easily with one hand. This one you must hold with two.
Yes, exactly. This is what's called a Yemenite shofar, this one here. And of course, it would come from the Yemenite community. And it is a beautiful, beautiful piece. People who are into animal rights and so on, they're not very happy with this stuff. But that being said, so let me blow a sound from here. Now, Ralph, do you know the sounds that are blown on the shofar?
Tekiah,
Yeah,
Trua,
Shavarim,
Shvarim,
Teruah.
Trua. Yeah, Tekiah, Shvarim, Trua, and Tekiah Gadol.
Do you know what they represent?
You tell me.
Yeah, so that they kind of represents like sounds of tears, the crying of the Jew, and then the shavarim, which is the three little breaks where we stand up,
Mm.
right? We look around, we actually see that the world can be bright, and then the long, long one at the end, the Tekiah Gadola, which again is meant to wake everybody up, to see who they are as a human being, to see what this world is all about, to see the beauty of it, and to see our tremendous potential. So I'll blow a couple of sounds. Usually, what happens is someone will go Tekiah. Do you want to do that?
Tekiah.
Shavarim.
I'm not hearing it. Um, there's no audio.
Oh, there's no audio.
Yeah, when you blow it, it goes quiet because I think it's above the range of what the Zoom can pick
Oh,
up.
oh, okay.
I'll
Well,
do
that's that. Tekiah, Shavarim, Teruah. Anyways, I guess you won't be able to hear it. You can go to YouTube and you'll hear it. But this is a shofar. These are shofars.
I know as soon as you did it, it just went silent, and it was just like, oh, the Lord has raised his hand against. It's when you said animal rights, you just, the whole
Is that
thing
what it
went,
was?
yeah, it went karmic nuts at that point. Nobody knew where to go with it. So we
We
can't
learned
play
something
that.
new. Learned something new about Zoom.
Well, we used to have one guy in the Sephardic synagogue, always an older man who was he was a very quiet man. But every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he was the man. Like you didn't even think he had it in him. And we would all literally time it on our watches when he'd start, especially Gadol, right? Like the big, long, last sonorous note that would just go on and on. But he nailed it every time. And we just
Wow.
loved it.
Yeah. You know what that reminds me of, Ralph? I remember when I went to north of Winnipeg, I went to a reserve there,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
was I was part of a drum session, a drum ritual that was going on, and I had been speaking to somebody prior to the drumming, and he told me about his really difficult life, how poor he was, and times were really hard for him. He was an alcoholic, and all of this stuff. He had lost his son, and then, sure enough, he gets up and he goes over to the drum with about five or six other guys, and they begin playing their liturgy, if you will.
Hmm.
And you know what I thought about, Ralph? I thought about sometimes in our community, the Jewish community, it's like the more affluent you are, the more honors you get, right?
Right.
And I'm sure that's not local just to our people, but I thought in the indigenous community, they have it right. They give honor to everybody. And that was a beautiful, beautiful moment for me and a very important learning moment as well.
Well, in the indigenous culture, you'll see the architecture of ritual is circles,
Yes,
right? It's not sage on a stage. It's not everybody faced one way. It's a circle, and circles flatten hierarchies. Nobody is top dog anymore.
correct.
You're all around the same fire. So I asked a friend of mine, indigenous friend of mine, he's from the States, and I told him about how we do our death rituals at our Shiva and how we stay together for upwards to a week if it happens to fall on the right day that way. Um, and tell stories about the person and don't say goodbye. Say I'll see you soon and all that stuff. And I said, what do you guys do? And he said, we keep a fire going for, I can't remember how many days. And we sit around that fire and tell stories about that person
Mm,
in a circle.
mm,
And I just thought, that's fantastic.
yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, listen, I don't know, 2 weeks from now, we'll see if we can do one and maybe we'll be in the middle of it all by then.
Yeah.
And right now, the rain is pouring down around me and the thunder is clapping. So it's
Getting you
God's
ready.
way of telling me. Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I just got to get that thing out of my head.
Don't do it.
So I'm happy you've recovered from COVID, and
Thank you.
I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you
Well,
very
you
much.
already do, I'm sure. And is there somewhere where people who want to be part of that walk in the forest can get in touch with you?
Yeah. They can either go to my Facebook page, which is Avram Rosenzweig, or they can go to my website, avramrosenzweig.com. And I guess the final thing would be avram.rosenzweig@gmail.com.
Okay, excellent. And for me, it's ralphbenmergy.ca, and everything you need to know is there. Oh, it's really raining. I'm very impressed.
It's
Um,
preparing you.
it is. It is the cleansing. Well, hope I didn't put too many plants on the front porch there. That won't work. You take care of yourself, and we'll do more. Yeah, and the shofar. Put it on YouTube. Uh, we'll figure it out that way, and we'll do more of Not That Kind of Rabbi real soon. All right.
Thank you, Ralph. Take care of yourself too.
Okay. Bye bye.